The roar of 50,000 voices shakes the stone beneath your feet. The smell of blood and sand hangs thick in the afternoon air. Two men circle each other in the arena below, weapons gleaming, armor catching the Roman sun. One will walk out, one won't. At least that's what you've been told. That's what the movies show you. Two men enter, one man leaves. Fight to the death, glory or extinction, the ultimate blood sport. But here's the thing about history. The truth is always more complicated than the story we've been sold. And when it comes to Roman gladiators, almost everything you think you know is wrong. These weren't just mindless killing machines throwing themselves into death matches for the entertainment of a bloodthirsty mob. They were trained athletes, valuable investments, and paradoxically, both the most despised and most celebrated people in Roman society. They were prisoners and slaves who became celebrities. They were considered lower than prostitutes in social standing, yet women from the upper classes paid fortunes for vials of their sweat. They fought in an industry that was part sport, part theater, and entirely designed to keep them alive just long enough to make their owners rich. The year is 264 BC. In the Forum Boarium, the cattle market of Rome, something is happening that will change the empire forever. Two wealthy brothers, the sons of a nobleman named Brutus Pera, have organized a funeral for their father. But this isn't just any funeral. They've brought in 3 pairs of slaves, armed them with swords and shields, and forced them to fight to the death in front of the mourners. It's a blood offering to honor the dead, a practice borrowed from the Etruscans, who believed that spilling blood at funerals would appease the spirits of the underworld. The crowd watches, transfixed. There's something primal about it, something that reaches into the Roman soul and takes hold. Within decades, these funeral games evolved into public spectacles. By 105 BC, they'd become tools of military training. By the time Julius Caesar took power, gladiatorial games had nothing to do with funerals at all. They were political propaganda, entertainment for the masses, and the ultimate display of imperial power. Emperors didn't host gladiator fights because they enjoyed watching men die. They hosted them because it kept the population distracted, loyal, and under control. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal called it. Feed them, entertain them, and they won't rebel. Under Emperor Domitian, Rome had 4 major gladiator schools operating simultaneously near the Colosseum. The largest, the Ludus Magnus, could house more than 1,000 fighters. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was an industry. And like any industry built on human bodies, it required a constant supply of raw material.
So where did gladiators come from? Most were slaves, purchased at the empire's sprawling slave markets after being captured as prisoners of war. When Rome conquered a territory, the defeated soldiers didn't just disappear. They were sold, sorted, and evaluated. The strongest, the most physically capable, were bought by Lanistae, the gladiator trainers, men who ran the schools like brutal corporations. After the Jewish revolt, hundreds of Jewish prisoners flooded into the gladiator schools. After the fall of Dacia, Dacian warriors filled the ranks. The empire turned its conquered enemies into entertainment, forcing them to fight and die for the amusement of the very people who destroyed their homelands. But not all gladiators were slaves. Some were criminals, sentenced to the arena as punishment for their crimes. These men had no training, no hope, and no chance. They were called Noxii, the condemned, and they weren't expected to survive. And then there were the volunteers. Free men who signed contracts to become gladiators, binding themselves to 3 to 5 years of service in exchange for money, fame, and the slim hope of glory. Historians estimate that more than 20% of gladiators in training schools were free men who chose this life voluntarily. Some were fleeing debt, some were chasing celebrity, some just wanted to know what it felt like to hold a sword and hear a crowd scream their name. But here's the catch. The moment you signed that contract, you became infamous, dishonorable, shameful. You lost all legal rights, all social standing, all protections under Roman law. You were grouped with prostitutes, actors, and criminals. You couldn't testify in court, couldn't hold public office, even be buried in a proper cemetery. You were legally nobody. And yet, paradoxically, you might become the most famous person in Rome. Let's talk about what life was actually like inside a Ludus, a gladiator school. Imagine a fortress prison. High walls, a single guarded entrance, rows of tiny cells, each measuring just 32 square feet. That's smaller than most modern bathrooms. You'd share that space with 1, maybe 2 other fighters. No privacy, no comfort, just stone walls and the smell of sweat and blood. Your day started before dawn. Physical conditioning came first, running, lifting, drilling with wooden weapons that were deliberately heavier than real ones to build strength and endurance. You'd practice against the palus, a 6-foot wooden post driven into the ground, striking it over and over until your arms screamed and your hands bled. Each gladiator specialized in a specific fighting style. If you were a Mamillo, you'd train with a large rectangular shield and a short sword, wearing heavy armor and a distinctive fish-crested helmet. If you were a Retiarius, you'd be nearly naked, armed only with a weighted net, a trident, and a dagger, relying on speed and agility to catch your opponent like a fisherman landing a catch. The Thrax fought with a curved scimitar and small shield, moving fast, striking from angles. The Secutal, designed specifically to hunt the Retiarius, wore a smooth, egg-shaped helmet to prevent the net from catching on it, though the design made it nearly impossible to see or breathe. Your instructors were called doctores, usually former gladiators who'd survived long enough to retire. They knew every technique, every weakness, every psychological trick that might keep you alive for one more fight. They taught you how to work the crowd, how to turn combat into performance, how to make even a defensive move look heroic. Because gladiatorial combat wasn't just about winning, it was about entertainment. The Romans wanted drama, suspense, near misses, and spectacular recoveries. They wanted you to bleed, but they didn't necessarily want you to die. At least not right away. You were an investment after all. And that brings us to one of the most surprising facts about gladiators. They ate a mostly vegetarian diet. Archaeological analysis of gladiator bones from the cemetery at Ephesus revealed that these warriors consumed primarily barley, beans, and dried fruit. Ancient Romans even called them hordearii, barley men. The reason wasn't philosophical, it was practical. Barley provided sustained energy for training and created a layer of subcutaneous fat that offered some protection from cuts and slashes in combat. It was cheaper than meat and easier to manage for feeding hundreds of fighters. The schools employed nutritionists who calculated precise diets to keep gladiators strong, but not so well fed that they became too valuable to risk. And when you did get injured, you received some of the best medical care in the ancient world. The Gladiator school at Pergamum employed Galen, one of history's most famous physicians, who would later become the personal doctor to multiple Roman emperors. He learned his craft by treating gladiator wounds, understanding human anatomy through the brutal injuries he witnessed daily.
Now, let's shatter another Hollywood myth. Gladiator fights almost never ended in death. Think about it from an economic perspective. A trained gladiator represented years of investment. The cost of purchasing a slave, feeding him, training him, housing him, treating his injuries, all of that added up to a substantial sum. Killing gladiators in every match would be financially catastrophic. According to research by historian George Vile, during the 1st century AD, only about 10% of gladiatorial combats ended in death for either fighter. If you were defeated but it fought well, your survival rate was roughly 80%. The defeated gladiator would signal surrender by raising a finger or thumb. The decision to spare or kill him rested with the editor, the sponsor of the games, usually responding to the crowd's wishes. But, contrary to popular belief, the thumbs down gesture probably didn't mean death. Historical evidence suggests that a closed fist or covered thumb indicated mercy, while an extended thumb pointing upward or outward might have signaled death, mimicking the motion of a sword thrust. The language around these gestures is murky, lost to time. But one thing is clear: most gladiators survived to fight another day. That doesn't mean survival was easy. A typical gladiator fought 2 to 3 times per year. If you survived 3 to 5 years, you'd face somewhere between 6 and 15 combats. The mortality rate accumulated over time. By the 3rd century AD, it had climbed to 25% per fight for defeated gladiators. Most fighters died between the ages of 20 and 30. The average gladiator who earned a tombstone, meaning they were successful enough to afford one, died around age 27. Only the exceptional ones made it past 10 fights. One legendary gladiator survived an extraordinary 150 bouts. Another lived to 90, presumably long after retirement. But these were outliers, superstars whose fame protected them from the worst of the violence. And fame was real. Gladiators occupied the strangest position in Roman society. Legally, they were infames, without rights or standing. But culturally, they were rock stars. Graffiti from Pompeii tells the story. Celidus, the Thracian, makes the girls swoon. Critians, the net fighter, catches girls by night. Women from wealthy families would pay enormous sums for vials of gladiator sweat, believing it had aphrodisiac properties. Some aristocratic women had affairs with gladiators despite the social scandal. Gladiators' images appeared on lamps, pottery, glassware, and jewelry. Children played with gladiator action figures. Spectators placed bets on their favorites. Emperors had preferred fighting styles. Caligula and Titus favored the Thracians. Domitian loved the Murmillo. Successful gladiators became wealthy, accumulating prize money and gifts from admirers. Some bought their freedom. Some became trainers. A few even married into prominent families, though such unions were heavily stigmatized. But for every success story, there were thousands who died anonymous deaths in the sand, buried in mass graves with no names, no monuments, no memory. And some refused to accept that fate. The year is 73 BC. In the Gladiator school of Capua, south of Rome, a plan is forming. More than 200 slaves and gladiators have plotted an escape. They're going to break out,
arm themselves, and run for freedom. But someone betrays them. Word reaches the guards. The punishment for attempted escape is torture, followed by execution. 70 men, knowing what's coming, decide they'd rather die fighting. Led by a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus, they raid the kitchens, grabbing knives, spits, and cleavers. They murder their instructors and guards, fight their way out of the compound, and steal wagons of gladiatorial weapons and armor from the school stores. Then they run for Mount Vesuvius. Rome sends a force of 3,000 men to surround the mountain and starve them out. But Spartacus, who'd once served in the Roman military, uses his tactical knowledge. His men weave ropes from vines, climb down the steep side of the volcano in the night, circle around, and slaughter the surprised Roman forces. Word spreads. Slaves from across the region abandon their masters and join the rebellion. Farm workers, household slaves, miners, anyone with nothing to lose. Within months, Spartacus commands tens of thousands. Within 2 years, his army numbers 120,000 men, women, and children. They're not just running anymore. They're winning. They defeat Roman militia. They crush trained legions under consular command. They sweep through southern Italy, liberating slaves, plundering estates, and proving that the Roman military machine can be beaten. For 3 years, Spartacus and his army terrorized the Roman Republic. They split into factions, with some leaders wanting to march on Rome itself, while Spartacus tries to lead his people north to freedom beyond the Alps. Eventually, the Senate assigns Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, to end the rebellion. Crassus doesn't take chances. He crucifies cowards in his own legions to restore discipline. He builds walls across southern Italy to trap rebels. He bribes the pirates who promise to help Spartacus escape by sea. In 71 BC, in a final desperate battle in Apulia, Spartacus fights with suicidal courage. Witnesses say he killed his own horse before the battle began, declaring that if he won, there would be plenty of horses, and if he lost, he wouldn't need one. He cut his way through the Roman lines, trying to reach Crassus himself, killing 2 centurions before being overwhelmed and cut down. His body was never identified. His army was annihilated. Crassus captured 6,000 survivors and crucified them along the Appian Way, one every 40 meters, from Capua all the way to Rome. A forest of crosses, a warning to every slave in the empire about the cost of rebellion. And yet, Spartacus's name survived, not as a villain, but as a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the human refusal to accept bondage. So what does all this tell us? Roman gladiators weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were human beings trapped in a machine designed to extract profit from their bodies and their blood. They were investments managed by businessmen, performers choreographing violence, and sometimes rebels who refused to die quietly. They lived in a society that simultaneously worshipped and despised them, that treated them as property while screaming their names in adoration, that built an entire entertainment industry on the premise that some lives were worth less than others. And here's the uncomfortable truth: we're not that different. We still watch violence for entertainment. We still celebrate people while denying them basic dignity. We still build systems that turn human beings into commodities. The gladiators are gone, but the arena never really closed. It just changed its name. If this story made you think, if it changed how you see history, or maybe even how you see the world today, do me a favor, hit that like button. Subscribe to The Midnight Historian for more stories about the people history tried to forget. Because the past isn't dead,
It's not even past. It's just waiting for someone to remember.